She heard the groom call her a bet, and still, she said, I do, because this wedding wasn't about love anymore. It was about revenge. He thought he had one laughing behind her back, playing with her heart like a game, but what he didn't know was that she was already holding the final card. And when the vows ended, her performance began. Because before she reached that altar, the story had already started long before. She thought she had found her forever. From the very first moment she met Daniel, it was as if the universe had finally answered every silent prayer she'd whispered into the dark. He appeared at the perfect time, confident, polished, magnetic in a way that drew not only her, but everyone around him. His presence wasn't just noticeable, it was commanding, like gravity itself had shifted to make room for him. His smile wasn't just charming, it was calculated, deliberate, like a weapon he wielded with precision. When he turned that smile on her, it felt as though the sun had bent low from the heavens just to bathe her in its warmth. He seemed to know exactly what to say, exactly how to move, exactly how to make her feel chosen. He held doors for her, pulled out her chair, offered his coat when the night air turned sharp. He leaned in close when she spoke, eyes locked on hers as if the rest of the world had vanished into shadows. Those were the moments that made her believe, with every fragile fiber of her being, that this man was different, that this was the man who would protect her, cherish her, and build a life worth remembering. And the world around her only fueled that belief. Friends leaned in with envious whispers. You're so lucky. Do you know how rare it is to find a man like him? Coworkers teased that she had caught a prince. Even strangers noticed the way he draped his arm around her shoulders, the way he positioned himself like a shield, and yet framed her as though she were his prized jewel. Daniel's family welcomed her with effortless smiles, but only because Daniel had presented her as part of his success story, another achievement to his name, another reflection of his brilliance. They adored him so much that their affection for her was automatic, conditional, borrowed from their love for him. For a while, it was intoxicating. She let herself float on the haze of it, allowed herself to believe she was chosen, special, the exception to every rule. She told herself this was their happily ever after had finally arrived. She let herself fall, and in the falling, she forgot to question where she might land. But love that shines too brightly casts the darkest shadows. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, the cracks began to appear. It started with little things, phrases delivered lightly, almost playfully, but sharp enough to cut if you listened closely. When she talked about her work, his lips curved into that infuriating smirk. That's cute, he'd say, dismissing her accomplishments with two simple words that reduced her pride into nothing. When she laughed too loudly at a joke, his hand would brush her arm, his voice low. Tone it down, sweetheart. People are staring. And when she dared to voice an opinion at dinner, his chuckle would silence her before his words did, the subject changing as though her thoughts were nothing but background noise. At first, she told herself these weren't red flags, just quirks, just the rough edges of a man who carried too much confidence. But those weren't quirks. They were tests, tests of how much she would bend, how much she would tolerate, how much of herself she was willing to give up, piece by piece, until nothing was left but the version of her that he approved of. And every time, she let it go. She brushed off the sting, telling herself he was stressed, that he didn't mean it, that love was supposed to be like this messy, imperfect, demanding compromise. Because love is blinding, isn't it? When you want something badly enough, you'll wrap your whole world around an illusion and call it truth. So she wore the illusion like a veil. She let the sparkle distract her from the shadows. She convinced herself that his love was solid, that his arms were safe, that this was real. But deep in her chest, a quiet unease began to grow. A weight she couldn't quite name pressed against her ribs, whispering to her in the silences between their words. It was there in the way his laughter sometimes rang hollow, cruel, instead of warm. It was there in the way his friends looked at her when they thought she wasn't paying attention, pity in their eyes, amusement hidden in the corners of their smirks. Sometimes she would walk into a room and feel the sudden shift, conversations halting mid-sentence, eyes darting away, as though she had stumbled into the middle of a private joke. A joke she didn't understand, a joke she suspected might be about her. She tried to tell herself she was imagining things, that she was being insecure, paranoid even. But a woman's instincts are powerful, and hers grew louder by the day. An insistent whisper clawing at her heart, something isn't right. Still, she stayed, because leaving meant admitting that everything she believed, everything she had dreamed, was a lie. And sometimes lies are easier to carry than the crushing weight of truth. But illusions are fragile. They never last forever. They always crack, they always break. And when they do, the shards cut deeper than you ever thought possible. She didn't know it yet, but the whispers weren't harmless. They weren't accidents, they were warnings, foreshadowing of a storm she couldn't yet see, because the fairy tale she thought she was living was nothing but a stage set for betrayal. And on the night before her wedding, when the veil of illusion was pulled back at last, she would discover that her love story had never been hers at all. It had been his game from the very beginning. The engagement should have been the happiest season of her life. Every morning, she looked down at the glittering ring on her finger and tried to let it sink in that she was chosen, that she was wanted, that her life was about to step into a new chapter most women only dreamt of. She told herself this was the moment she was meant to feel safe, cherished, certain. And yet, deep inside, the certainty never came. On the surface, it was perfect. There were endless dinners, toasts raised in her honor, laughter spilling from crowded rooms. Friends leaned close and whispered their envy. You're the luckiest woman alive. Her own family beamed, relieved to see her with a man who seemed capable, respectable, wealthy. Daniel looked the part in every photo, every handshake, every gentle squeeze of her hand under the table, and yet none of it quieted the small, stubborn knot of unease twisting inside her. It began with the way his friends treated her. At first, she brushed it off as awkwardness. They'd known Daniel for years, after all. She was the newcomer, the outsider trying to step into a circle that had already drawn its lines. Maybe that explained the way they laughed harder when she wasn't around. Maybe it explained the way conversations stumbled to a halt the second she entered the room. But the more she noticed it, the less it felt like coincidence. There was the time at an engagement dinner when she caught one of them leaning close to another, whispering something sharp and quick before both erupted into laughter. As soon as they realized she was standing behind them, their smiles vanished, their glasses lifted, and they offered her a clumsy toast to the bride-to-be. Their eyes told a different story, amusement hiding behind politeness. Another time, while she adjusted her earring in the bathroom mirror, she overheard two voices outside the door. They spoke in low tones, muffled but not enough. She heard her name. She heard one of them snicker and say, "Just wait until the wedding." The words sank like stones into her stomach. And when she stepped out, they both froze, their faces stiffening before they plastered on smiles. One muttered, "Congratulations," before slipping past her. It was always like that, words cut short, eyes that wouldn't meet hers, laughter that died too quickly. And Daniel, he always had an explanation ready. "They're just kidding around," he'd say with that easy smile, sliding his arm around her shoulders as though his touch could erase everything she'd just witnessed. "Don't take them seriously. They don't mean any harm." But she noticed how carefully he spoke, how quick he was to dismiss, how his tone never quite matched his eyes. His voice carried reassurance. His eyes carried calculation. And she wanted to believe him God, how she wanted to. Because believing him meant keeping her fairy tale intact. Believing him meant silencing the doubts that woke her at night. But the whispers followed her everywhere. At the rehearsal dinner, she watched his friends leaning back in their chairs, their glasses raised, their voices booming. Laughter spilled from their table like smoke from a fire. She couldn't catch every word, but she knew by instinct it was about her. When she approached, the laughter died, and they greeted her with two smooth smiles. It was like living in a house where the walls whispered behind your back. She told herself she was imagining it, that she was letting nerves twist her perception. After all, weddings are stressful, that's what everyone said. Maybe she was just overthinking, maybe she was insecure, but deep in her gut, she knew better. A woman always knows when something is wrong. Even if she doesn't have proof, her soul feels it. and her soul was screaming. Late at night, when Daniel thought she was asleep, she lay awake staring at the ceiling. Every whisper replayed in her mind, every laugh, every look, every incomplete sentence that hung heavy in the air when she walked into a room. She pressed her hand to her stomach, trying to settle the storm inside her, telling herself tomorrow would be better, that tomorrow she'd feel sure again. But tomorrow always brought the same gnawing unease. She wanted so badly to believe that marriage would silence the doubts, that once she was his wife, all those whispers would vanish, replaced with certainty. She wanted to believe love was stronger than suspicion. But love, when it's built on lies, only blinds you. And sometimes the truth doesn't wait politely for you to be ready. Sometimes it crashes into you when you least expect it. And for her, the crash came the night before the wedding when she stumbled upon a conversation she was never meant to hear. A conversation that stripped the fairy tale to its bones and revealed the cruel joke beneath. That was the night she discovered she wasn't a bride. She was a bet. The night before the wedding should have been a dream. It should have been the moment she had imagined since she was a little girl, soft light spilling through the curtains, a heart pounding with nervous excitement, and the quiet reassurance that tomorrow she would walk down the aisle and begin a new chapter of her life. It should have been the calm before the storm, the final page of a fairy tale she had written in her head, with the man she believed loved her waiting at the altar. She wanted to surprise him. That was the plan. She had written a small note in her neat, careful handwriting, folded it delicately, and slipped it into her purse. A note that said, "I can't wait to be your wife." Simple, honest, overflowing with love. She thought leaving it on his nightstand would remind him of the woman waiting at the end of the aisle, the woman who had given him her trust, her future, her everything. But fate had other plans. The hallway leading to his suite was quiet, wrapped in that eerie silence hotels carry after midnight. The patterned carpet muted the sound of her heels, and the floral wallpaper glowed dimly beneath the soft wall lamps. Every step she took felt like walking deeper into a dream. She clutched the note to her chest, smiling at the thought of how his face would light up when he found it. She pictured him reading her words, maybe running his hand through his hair, whispering, "She's perfect." She thought she knew how this night would end, but then she heard it. Voices, male voices, deep, careless, spilling through the crack beneath his door. At first they were muffled, just a low thrum of conversation mixed with laughter. His laughter was there, too sharp, unmistakable. It made her pause, and for a fleeting second she smiled. She thought it was just nerves. Just his friends ribbing him about one last night of freedom before marriage. Harmless, she told herself. Just men being men. But as she stepped closer, the words sharpened into focus. And what she heard didn't sound like love. It didn't sound like excitement for a wedding. It sounded like mockery. "Man, I still can't believe you pulled it off." The words slipped through the door, muffled but clear enough to pierce straight through her. And then his voice, the man she was supposed to marry in less than 24 hours, answered, dripping with pride, dripping with arrogance. "Of course I did. I told you all I could make her fall. She was too easy." She actually believed it. The laughter that followed wasn't the playful kind. It was sharp, cruel, the kind of laughter that leaves bruises on the soul. Her blood ran cold. She froze in place, her body rigid, her hand tightening around the folded note in her purse until the paper crumpled under her grip. The smile that had lit her face moments ago shattered into nothingness. Her heart pounded so violently she thought the men inside might hear it through the door. Another voice chimed in, mocking, curious. "So what now after the vows? You're really going through with it?" Daniel's response came without hesitation, without even the decency of a pause. "Why wouldn't I? A bet's a bet. You all thought I couldn't do it. You thought she was too smart, too strong. But look at me now, she's walking right into it." The room erupted again, louder this time. Glasses clinking, chairs scraping, the kind of laughter that doesn't just wound, it carves scars into your bones. She pressed her back against the wall, the wallpaper cold against her skin, her chest heaving with shallow breaths. She wanted to burst in, to scream until her throat tore, to throw the ring back at him and demand he explain how he could reduce her entire life, her entire heart, to a game. She wanted to shake him, to make him look her in the eye and see the destruction he had caused, but she didn't move. Not yet. Her rage told her to crash through that door. Her pride told her to stay, and so she stayed silent, listening, her body trembling as every word drove the knife deeper. The more she listened, the more the truth spilled out. Every detail of his betrayal unfolded carelessly, like scraps of garbage tossed onto the floor. She thinks it's real, Daniel bragged, his voice louder than the rest. She thinks I love her. I mean, look at her ordinary, nothing special. But she bought every word. When I win, you all owe me. Drinks, cash, whatever we agreed, a bet's a bet. The room howled with approval. One of his friends whistled, another clapped, another shouted that he was a genius. And she? She stood frozen, her heart burning as if her ribcage had caught fire. Tears should have been streaming down her face, but they didn't come. Her body didn't betray her with sobs or weakness. Instead, her hands shook, her throat tightened, and her vision blurred not with sadness, but with rage. Because in that moment, something inside her shifted. Something broke. Yes, but in the place of that broken piece, something else was born. She had spent months believing in a fairy tale, ignoring the doubts that whispered in the corners of her mind, silencing the little voice that asked if he truly loved her. But no more. The fairy tale was dead, burned to ash. And standing in those ashes, a new bride emerged, not a naive woman waiting to be claimed, but a woman preparing for battle. She didn't storm in. She didn't cry. She didn't let him see her shattered heart, because why give him that satisfaction? Why let him know she had overheard his confession? Instead, she turned, walked back down the hall with her hands trembling, but her chin lifted, every step echoing with new resolve. With each stride, her plan began to take shape, not a plan of surrender, but of vengeance. If he thought she was just a bet, he had no idea what kind of game he had really entered, because tomorrow, when the priest asked if she would take this man to be her husband, she would say, I do. But it wouldn't be a promise, it wouldn't be a vow, it would be a sentence of his own destruction. And when the morning came, she wore not just the dress of a bride, but the armor of a warrior. The veil no longer symbolized innocence, but a mask hiding the fire in her eyes. Tomorrow wasn't the beginning of his victory. Tomorrow would be the beginning of his end. The morning of her wedding arrived like a cruel joke. Sunlight spilled through the curtains in golden ribbons, painting the room in warmth, but none of it touched her. The birds sang, the world buzzed, people downstairs whispered about the beauty of the day, as if the universe itself had aligned to bless her union. To them, this was the happiest day of her life. To her, it was the battlefield she had been forced onto overnight. Her heart should have been fluttering with anticipation, with nerves, with the breathless excitement of a bride about to say, I do. Instead, it beat with the cold, steady rhythm of steel. Not a heart in love, but a heart preparing for war. She sat in the makeup chair, surrounded by mirrors that reflected versions of her she barely recognized. The room was alive with chatter, laughter, the spray of perfume in the air, the click of curling irons. Bridesmaids teased one another, tossing playful comments about who would catch the bouquet. Her mother adjusted her necklace with trembling fingers and teary eyes, whispering blessings under her breath, blessings she no longer believed in. Every person in that room saw only the surface, a woman glowing on her wedding day, cheeks flushed, eyes bright, lips curved in a serene smile. They didn't see the storm beneath the silk and lace. They didn't hear the roar of betrayal echoing in her mind, or feel the sting of words that had gutted her less than 12 hours earlier. Every time someone touched her shoulder and said, You look stunning, you're glowing, she forced her lips to curve upward. She let them believe it. They thought her glow came from joy, from love, from the pure anticipation of a lifelong union. But it wasn't joy that lit her face. It was fury, disguised as grace. It was the fire of betrayal burning behind her eyes, carefully hidden under layers of powder, rouge, and a carefully applied veil. She had mastered the art of pretending long before this day, but now she would need that skill more than ever. Every thank you was hollow. Every laugh was an empty shell. Every nod was calculated, measured, practiced like lines in a script she could no longer abandon. She played the part because the part protected her, No one could know. Not her friends, not her family, not even the bridesmaid who leaned in and whispered, "You must be so happy." If anyone suspected, if even one person guessed the truth, the plan would shatter before it could unfold. So she hid it. She buried her heartbreak beneath layers of powder and rouge, under the weight of diamonds and lace, beneath the veil that cast her face in soft, angelic light. When Daniel's family entered, their eyes glistened with pride, their voices laced with affection for their golden boy. They saw him as a man of integrity, a man of charm, a man worth admiring. They adored him, blind to his truth, blind to the ugliness he had revealed when he thought no one was listening. His friends, the same ones who had laughed with him in that hotel room, slapped him on the back and called him lucky. Their smirks made bile rise in her throat, but she kept her composure. She looked at them all, each blind and foolish, and thought, "You have no idea. By tonight you'll see him for what he really is." And then the music began. The doors opened, the crowd rose to their feet. Walking down the aisle, every eye was on her. Every flash of a camera immortalized her in the lie she had chosen to wear. Every whisper carried awe. She walked not as a bride filled with love, but as an actress stepping onto the stage of the most important performance of her life. She smiled because smiling disarmed suspicion. She glided because grace disguised fury. To the hundreds of faces watching, she was perfect, the glowing bride who had found her fairy tale ending. But behind the veil, behind that mask, her lips whispered silently to herself, "Play your part. Hold steady. The moment is coming." When she reached Daniel, he turned and took her hand. To the crowd, it looked tender, romantic, his thumb brushing her skin, his grip firm and reassuring. To her, it felt like iron shackles. She looked into his eyes, those same eyes that had once convinced her she was cherished. And now, knowing what she knew, all she saw was emptiness. His gaze no longer stirred butterflies, it stirred disgust. Still, she kept the mask firmly in place. The priest began the ceremony, his voice solemn and reverent, but the words were little more than a hum in her ears. Blessings, prayers, promises, they blurred together like background noise. All she could hear, playing on a loop in her mind, was his voice from the night before, mocking her, belittling her, reducing her to a bed among friends. Of course I did. She was too easy. Each cruel word burned through her with every passing second. Each memory sharpened her anger into something lethal, but her face never betrayed her. She smiled at the right moments, nodded when expected, even blinked back the tears her mother assumed were tears of joy. Her performance was flawless, her mask unbreakable. She was every bit the perfect bride, the image Daniel wanted her to be. But she knew something he didn't. This was her stage, not his. And underneath it all, her heart sharpened itself into a weapon. Every whispered vow he spoke, every promise of forever he declared to the priest and the crowd, became one more lie stacked onto his pile of deceit. And with every lie, she drew closer to her moment. Because she knew when the time came, when it was her turn to speak, her mask would not fall. No, it would become her sword. He stood tall beside her, the center of attention, looking every bit like the man the world believed him to be. His suit was flawless, his tie straight, his posture perfect. His hand trembled just enough to make it look like he was overcome with emotion. His voice caught just enough to convince the crowd that he was deeply, madly in love. But she knew better. Every detail of his performance was calculated, every gesture rehearsed, every sigh manufactured. The priest invited him to share his vows, and Daniel began with a practiced pause, lowering his eyes as though gathering courage. Then he lifted his gaze to hers and smiled, that dazzling smile that had once swept her off her feet. He spoke of destiny. He spoke of how, from the moment he met her, he had known she was the one. He painted their love story with careful strokes, each word chosen to sound genuine, each phrase polished like a gem to catch the light. To the guests, it was perfection. Murmurs of admiration rippled through the pews. Someone whispered, "So romantic." Someone else dabbed tears from their eyes. It was the kind of vow people recorded on their phones so they could replay it later, proof that fairy tales existed in real life. But for her, standing inches away, Every word was a blade. She didn't hear romance, she heard mockery. Every time he said forever, she remembered his laughter in that hotel room mocking her trust. Every time he said honor, she remembered him boasting about the bet. Every time he swore that he couldn't live without her, she thought of his friends clapping him on the back, congratulating him for playing her so easily. Her chest tightened, but not from sadness. The ache that might have once broken her had hardened into something sharper. Rage moved through her veins like wildfire, but her face betrayed nothing. She nodded gently, eyes steady, lips curved into the faintest smile, as though his words melted her heart. The crowd saw a bride touched by her groom's love. He saw a woman ready to commit her life to him. Only she knew the truth, that beneath the veil, every breath she took was filled with fury. Daniel ended his vows with a flourish, his voice low and heavy with feigned sincerity. "You are my heart, my home, my forever," he said, squeezing her hand dramatically. The guests sighed again, swept up in the performance, their hearts moved by what they thought was real. Then the priest turned to her. The silence was thick, reverent, the kind of silence that holds its breath, waiting for history to be made. "Do you take this man to be your husband?" the priest asked. She looked at Daniel. For a moment, everything else faded. The flowers, the guests, the musics, it all blurred into the background. All she could see was his face, the face of the man who had reduced her love to a bet, the face of the man who thought he had already won. His eyes gleamed with smugness, just enough for her to notice. They said, "I own you. I fooled you. You'll never leave me now." And then she answered, "I do." Her voice was calm, steady, ringing clear enough for every person in the room to hear. Applause erupted instantly. Guests beamed, some clapping, some holding their hearts, overcome with emotion. To them, it was the sound of a promise. To them, it was the beginning of a marriage. But to her, it was a weapon. Those two words were not a vow. They were a verdict. Daniel leaned in and kissed her, slow and dramatic, playing to the crowd as cameras flashed. He tasted victory in that kiss. He thought it was the seal of his triumph. He thought the game was over, that he had won. But she kissed him back with patience, with calculation, with the certainty of a woman biding her time. She let him think he was still in control. She let the guests believe in the illusion, because the mask was still in place and the game wasn't finished. When the kiss ended, when the priest declared them husband and wife, when the music swelled and the audience roared with approval, she smiled wide for the cameras. To everyone watching, she was a woman swept away by love. But in her heart, she whispered a promise only she could hear. "Enjoy this moment, Daniel. It will be the last time you feel untouchable." The ceremony was over. The vows were sealed. The performance was complete. And now the stage was set for what came next. Because the reception wasn't just a celebration, it was a battlefield waiting to erupt. And there, under the glittering lights and raised glasses, the first cracks in his perfect facade would begin to show. The reception hall shimmered with perfection, a carefully constructed illusion designed to dazzle the senses. Golden chandeliers dangled from the ceiling like crowns of fire, spilling light so warm it made diamonds burn brighter and champagne glow like molten gold. White linen cascaded over endless rows of tables, roses in full bloom perfumed the air, and crystal glasses caught the light like prisms, scattering rainbows across smiling faces. The band played softly, their notes weaving through the laughter of guests, a melody that promised joy, celebration, forever. To anyone watching, it was flawless. A fairy tale ending brought to life. A husband, a wife, two families bound together by love. The kind of scene that would later live forever in photographs, in whispered memories, in albums passed down through generations. But to her, this wasn't a fairy tale. This wasn't love. This was theater. And tonight, she wasn't the bride they thought she was. She was the playwright, the director, and the executioner waiting for the final act to begin. From the moment she stepped into that room, her role shifted. She was no longer simply Daniel's bride. She was the woman who would take back her power. Every smile she offered was a weapon, every polite nod a blade hidden in velvet. Her laugh, light and charming, was as rehearsed as her vows had been. She glowed, radiant under the chandeliers, and to the guests she was the very image of joy, but inside she was ice, sharp, controlled, calculating. Her eyes moved constantly, mapping the room like a chessboard. She knew every position, every piece. Daniel's parents sat near the center, glowing with pride, ready to absorb every detail. His colleagues, sharp and calculating themselves, lingered along the edges, measuring everything with cool, watchful eyes. His friends, those men who had laughed at her expense, clustered too close to the head table, already flushed with drink, already careless. Every seat, every glance, every whispered aside was noted, stored, catalogued. When the truth came crashing down, she wanted it to fall like a hammer, hitting all of them at once. Daniel, of course, moved through the room like a conquering hero. He wore his pride like a crown, flashing that easy smile, shaking hands, raising his glass, pulling her close for staged kisses that looked tender but felt like chains. Every touch was a performance. Every whisper in her ear was meant to sound sweet, but to her, each one echoed with his laughter from the night before, the cruel memory of him calling her nothing but a bet. That word still rang in her ears like a blade striking stone. She smiled anyway. She leaned into him when he pulled her close, her face the picture of devotion. He thought she was still conquered, still blind, still his. He had no idea that every step he took was leading him closer to his own ruin. Patience. That was her greatest weapon. Patience and timing. Revenge wasn't. Laudit was deliberate, precise, so she let him shine, let him bask, let him stand in the glow of admiration, let his friends laugh too hard, whisper too carelessly, exchange looks they thought no one noticed. She caught every smirk, every crooked grin, every joke that died the second she stepped within earshot, and this time, unlike before, it didn't wound her. It didn't make her shrink. This time, she smiled wider, because she knew soon their laughter would turn to silence. As the night deepened, she began her quiet choreography. A word to the photographer, whispered gently, ensuring his lens stayed fixed on the head table. A subtle reminder to the DJ, the secret cues they had agreed on tucked into her soft smile. A carefully placed comment to Daniel's aunt during dinner, just enough of a phrase, a raised brow, a tone laced with quiet meaning that made the older woman glance at her nephew with something less than admiration. She didn't need to pull the trigger herself. All she had to do was plant the seeds. The rest would grow on their own. Meanwhile, Daniel's ego swelled with each toast. He clinked glass after glass, his laughter booming over the music, his humility practiced, his charm rehearsed. He thanked his parents with solemn words, kissed her cheek to the applause of his friends, raised his glass higher with each cheer. He thought this was his peak, his crowning moment, the perfect ending to his story. He thought he had fooled them all. He thought she was too weak, too blind, too hopelessly in love to ever see through him. But she saw everything. She saw the cracks beginning to form in his mask, cracks he hadn't noticed yet. She saw the slight tightening of his mother's mouth when his friends grew too loud. She saw the way his colleagues leaned together, whispering, judging, noting the arrogance slipping through his polished exterior. She saw the careful looks exchanged when his laughter rang a little too sharp, his words carried a little too much pride. His image was fragile, more fragile than he realized, and she knew it would take only one push to make it collapse, and she was ready. The air in the hall shifted as the night wore on, the atmosphere heavy with something unsaid. Beneath the music, beneath the clinking of silverware and the laughter, she could feel it, the storm drawing closer, the moment pressing in. Her heart didn't race, it beat steady, like a drum counting down. She had prepared for this. Every breath, every glance, every step had been a rehearsal for this exact scene. The beauty of it all was that the first crack didn't have to come from her. No better if it didn't. The first crack would come from them, the very men who had mocked her, who had reduced her to a bet, who thought themselves untouchable. They were careless. They were arrogant. And arrogance always slips. And then it happened. The best man rose unsteadily from his chair, his cheeks flushed crimson from too much champagne. Glass in hand, he stumbled toward the microphone, grinning wide, his words already slurring enough to draw nervous laughter from the guests. He promised a toast, he said, a few light-hearted words about the groom. The room quieted, expectant, ready for sentiment, ready for sweetness. But what came out of his mouth wasn't sweet. It wasn't harmless. It wasn't safe. It was the slip she had been waiting for. And with that slip, the first thread of Daniel's perfect mask began to unravel. The best man staggered forward, his glass of champagne raised high, the liquid inside trembling dangerously close to the rim. His grin was wide, sloppy, the kind born from too many toasts and not enough self-control. Guests chuckled softly, charmed by his looseness, expecting harmless stories, silly jokes about bachelor nights, clumsy tales of late adventures, the usual ribbing that made receptions sparkle with laughter. But she didn't laugh. She didn't even blink. Instead, her eyes narrowed, her entire body coiled in quiet readiness, because she knew something he didn't. Drunken men never keep secrets. He cleared his throat with exaggerated drama, swaying until the microphone squealed with a sharp feedback that made a few guests wince. "Ladies and gentlemen," he declared, his voice booming too loudly for the room, "let me tell you this guy, this Daniel." He hiccuped, then cackled at himself, and for a moment the crowd laughed along, indulgent and forgiving. Polite smiles bloomed across the tables, cameras lifted in expectation, ready to capture a warm moment of friendship. But what came next didn't warm anyone, it froze them. "I mean, who would have thought, huh?" he slurred, tilting his glass dangerously. "Who would have thought a bet could turn into a wedding?" The words dropped into the air like shards of glass. The room stilled, forks hovered in midair. Champagne glasses froze halfway to lips, and the laughter that had been building collapsed into an unnatural silence. For a heartbeat, it felt as though the entire hall forgot how to breathe. At the head table, she didn't flinch. Her lips curved into the faintest smile, controlled and deliberate, as if she had been expecting this very moment. Her chest tightened, not with hurt, but with dark satisfaction. The first crack had split the mask, right on cue. Daniel's head whipped toward his friend, eyes wide, panic flashing across his carefully composed face. "What are you talking about?" he hissed, his voice low but still sharp enough that the microphone caught the edges. His tone didn't soothe suspicion, it magnified it. The best man, oblivious in his drunken haze, only laughed louder. He raised his glass higher, nearly spilling it over the rim. "You know the bet," he shouted with sloppy cheer. "Told us all he could do it, that shed fall for him. And damn, look at this. He won." The gas that rolled through the room was almost physical, like a wave crashing against the walls. Women covered their mouths, men muttered under their breath, and whispers burst across the tables like wildfire. A bet? Did he just say she was a bet? The words flew faster than Daniel could catch them, igniting suspicion, disbelief, outrage. Daniel shot to his feet, his face blazing red, the smooth charm he wore like armor falling apart in seconds. "He's drunk," he shouted, his laugh brittle and hollow. "He doesn't know what he's saying." He tried to wave it off with forced amusement, but his voice trembled. Everyone heard it. Everyone felt the break in his mask, and she remained still, perfectly still, like a queen watching her enemy flail before the inevitable strike. She let the silence stretch, let the whispers deepen, let Daniel sweat under the weight of their stares. She didn't need to do anything yet. The room was doing it for her. Mothers shook their heads in shock, their expressions tightening with judgment. Fathers leaned close to one another, muttering low and urgent. Friends glanced nervously between her and Daniel, unsure where to place their loyalty. The joyous hum of the reception had vanished, replaced with a simmering unease that filled every corner. Under the table, Daniel's hand clamped down on hers, his grip iron, his palm damp with desperation. To the crowd, it looked like affection, a tender reassurance, but she felt the truth. It was fear, a tether, a chain. He was begging her silently to hold his collapsing world together. She didn't pull away, she let him cling, let him believe for a fleeting moment that he still had control. But her stillness was not submission, it was patience. Because she knew what he didn't. This wasn't just a slip of the tongue. This was the spark that would ignite the blaze, and she was ready to watch it spread. She tilted her head slightly, her eyes locking with his. He looked back with panic, with pleading, his gaze frantic as though searching for mercy. She gave him none. Instead, she smiled a sweet, dangerous smile, soft enough to fool the crowd, sharp enough to slice through him. A smile that whispered, "It's over. You just don't know it yet." The best man collapsed gracelessly back into his chair, sloshing champagne across the tablecloth, muttering incoherent apologies. But it didn't matter. The damage was irreversible. The room was poisoned now. The word bet hung in the air, heavy and undeniable. Daniel scrambled, laughing too loudly, speaking too quickly, desperate to reclaim the night. But his laughter rang hollow, his excuses flimsy. The guests weren't blind anymore. They had heard enough. She stayed calm, her silence louder than any denial he could shout. The truth had slipped free, and now the room was hers, and she hadn't even lifted her voice yet, because her moment was still to come. Soon she would rise, soon she would take the microphone, and when she spoke, there would be no drunken slurs, no accidental slips. The truth would not only be whispered, it would be carved into the air, permanent and unforgettable, leaving Daniel with nowhere left to hide. The reception hall glittered like a dream spun out of gold. Chandeliers bathed the room in light, and flowers spilled across every table in carefully arranged perfection. Golden lights stretched across the ceiling like constellations, casting a warm glow that should have felt magical. But under all that beauty, the air was suffocating. The words from the best man's drunken slip, "She was just a bet," still lingered, like a toxin that had seeped into every breath. No one dared repeat it aloud, but it was there, heavy and undeniable, hanging over every laugh that failed, every glance that darted nervously toward the head table. Daniel tried to patch the cracks with charm. He laughed too loudly, spoke too quickly, leaned in too often, but the charm that once made him magnetic now looked brittle, like paint peeling from a wall. His smile stretched wide, yet his eyes betrayed him. They flickered restlessly, searching, desperate. Beneath the table, his hand gripped hers so hard, his knuckles whitened, as if he believed sheer force could keep her silent, could keep her bound. To him, but she was no longer his hostage. His touch felt like a chain, and she had already decided to break it. Then, over the thick silence, the DJ's voice cut through, and now, he announced cheerfully, "A few words from our beautiful bride." The room clapped, but it wasn't the applause of joy. It was uncertain, uneven, the hollow clatter of people who didn't know what else to do. Some clapped politely, others hesitated, and a few simply stared, waiting for her. All eyes turned. She rose slowly, deliberately, every movement controlled. Her gown shimmered beneath the lights as though it were spun from fire itself. The sound of her heels striking the polished floor echoed through the hall like a countdown. Step by step, she walked toward the microphone, not rushed, not timid, but steady, regal, the way a queen approaches her throne. The music faded, the whispers died, the world seemed to hold its breath. She reached the microphone and adjusted it with calm hands. For a moment, she didn't speak. She let the silence work for her, let it stretch until anticipation became unbearable. Then she lifted her chin, and when she spoke, her voice carried clear and steady across the hall. First, she began, her tone smooth. "I want to thank all of you for being here tonight. Family, friends, loved ones, you've traveled near and far to witness this day, and I am grateful. Grateful to stand here in this dress, in this moment, before you all." A ripple of relief moved through the crowd. Smiles returned, hesitant but hopeful. Guests leaned forward, convinced that she would smooth everything over, that she would stitch the story back together into something presentable, something they could believe. Phones lifted, cameras clicked. They expected warmth, sweetness, a glowing bride. But sweetness was long gone. Her voice hardened slightly, every word deliberate, sharpened to a blade. "When I was a little girl, I dreamed of what this day would be like. The flowers, the music, the man who would stand beside me. I imagined love deep, unshakable, real. I imagined someone who would honor me, protect me, and cherish me." She paused, her eyes sweeping across the room, locking on faces that hung on her every syllable. "And today I should be living that dream, but instead I am living something else."
The silence deepened. Daniel's body stiffened at the head table. His frozen smile was carved onto his face like stone, but his eyes burned with warning. He leaned in, whispering sharply, "Don't." His
voice was a hiss meant only for her ears, but his panic was clear to anyone who dared look closely enough. She ignored him. She didn't even glance his way. Instead, she turned her gaze back to the crowd, her eyes blazing with quiet power. Her voice rose just enough to pierce the tension. Because love, she said, letting the word linger, should never be a game. It should never be a performance, and it should never ever be a bet. The words struck like lightning. Gasps rippled through the hall. Hands flew to mouths. Heads swiveled toward Daniel, searching for answers. The guests had heard it once as a drunken slip, but now it was spoken with clarity, conviction, finality. There was no laughing it away. She let the silence breathe, let it press down on every table, every guest. Then she leaned closer to the microphone, her voice lower, sharper, daring anyone to look away. And yet, that is exactly what this was. The whispers erupted instantly, racing across the hall like wildfire. Daniel's mother clutched her chest, whispering urgently to his father, whose face had gone cold with fury. Friends glanced at one another in disbelief, their eyes flicking between her and Daniel, unsure where the truth lived, but beginning to see it unfold before them. Daniel's hand clamped down on her arm again, harder this time. His smile cracked under the weight of his own unraveling mask. "Enough," he hissed, his voice trembling. "You're making a fool of yourself." She turned to him slowly, brushing his grip off with nothing more than the flick of her wrist, like dust she was finished tolerating. Then she looked back at the crowd, her lips curving into a calm, dangerous smile. This marriage, she declared, her voice steady as steel, wasn't born out of love. It wasn't destiny. It wasn't fate. It was a dare. A cruel joke whispered in dark corners, my heart, my dignity, my life used as nothing more than a game between men who thought I wouldn't find out. Gasps rang out louder now, unrestrained. Some guests sat stunned, others shook their heads in disgust. A woman at the back whispered fiercely, "How could he?" A man muttered, "Shameful." Daniel's perfect VOD collapsed. His face reddened, his fists tightened, his voice cracked as he tried to shout, "She's lying." But the crack in his voice betrayed him, and everyone heard it. She stood taller, her voice unwavering, every word delivered like a verdict. "No," she said, her tone slicing through the air. "I am not lying, and you won't have to take my word for it. You'll hear it from him, from his own mouth." The crowd froze, stunned. Confusion rippled across their faces. What did she mean? What proof did she have? She let the silence stretch again, watching Daniel squirm, watching the room lean in. Then she tilted her head, her smile calm, lethal. "Because words are only the beginning," she said softly, her voice dropping to a chilling promise. "And I have more than words." The reception hall was no longer just a place of celebration, it had become an arena. The chandeliers glittered above like silent judges, their crystal light bouncing across faces twisted in shock, anger, and disbelief. Plates of half-eaten food sat abandoned on tables, champagne glasses clutched tightly or dropped to the floor in trembling hands. The fairy tale wedding had transformed into a theater of truth, and every guest was glued to the stage where she stood, veil shimmering faintly under the lights, her expression unwavering. Daniel, once the center of admiration, now looked like a man trapped. His shoulders sagged, his lips pressed into a thin line as beads of sweat dotted his forehead. He kept darting his eyes around the room, searching for someone, anyone to defend him. But no one moved. No one would save him now. She held the microphone with the steadiness of someone who had rehearsed this moment 1,000 times in her mind. And perhaps she had. Because betrayal of this depth doesn't leave you broken, it leaves you sharpened. "Tonight," she said, her voice carrying through the speakers, clear and cutting, "you don't have to take my word for what he's done. You can hear it for yourself." Her hand, graceful yet deliberate, dipped into the folds of her gown and drew out her phone. For a second, confusion rippled through the audience. Was this another dramatic gesture? Then, with a flick of her thumb, she synced it to the sound system. The small screen glowed, and the air thickened with anticipation. Daniel lunged forward, whispering hoarsely, "Stop this! Stop it right now!" His hand twitched as though to snatch the phone away, but he froze when he realized the crowd was watching, their eyes suspicious, their bodies leaning toward her. He was cornered, trapped not by walls, but by the weight of judgment pressing in on him. She pressed play. The room went still. For a heartbeat, all that filled the speakers was a crackle of static, and then his voice, Daniel's voice, rang out, smug and venomous. "Of course she'll say yes," the recording sneered. Laughter followed, cruel and careless. "She's desperate enough to believe every word I tell her. This whole thing, it's just a bet, a game. And when I'm done, I'll walk away with everything. Her, the money, the land, it's all mine." The hall erupted in gasps so loud they drowned the chandelier's soft hum. A woman in the front row clutched her chest. A man muttered, "Unbelievable," shaking his head in disgust. His family's faces twisted with shame. His mother, pale and trembling, dropped her champagne glass, the shards scattering across the polished floor like broken illusions. Daniel's face drained of all color. He mouthed silent protests. "That's not me, it's taken out of context," but the voice booming through the speakers left no room for doubt. His words were venom, his tone dripping with arrogance, and every guest knew it. The recording rolled on. "I told the guys it would be easy," his voice continued, cruelly confident. "She's naive, soft, easy to manipulate. They all laughed when I said I'd make her fall in love with me, but I won. I got her. And soon, you'll get everything else too." Each word landed like a hammer against the walls of the hall, shaking the foundation of the night itself. The fairy tale crumbled, revealing the rot beneath. Daniel tried again, desperation cracking his voice. "She's lying. This is fake." But no one moved to support him. Even his closest friends stared at the floor, their shame written across their faces. The guests began to stir, their whispers rising like the hiss of a storm. "How could he? She doesn't deserve this." Monster. The tide had turned, and Daniel was drowning in it. She let it play to the end. She didn't stop the recording early, didn't spare him. She wanted every word, every ounce of poison he had spewed to be heard. She wanted the world to see the man he really was, not the charming groom in a tailored suit, but the coward who had made a woman's heart into his gambling chip. When the recording ended, silence swallowed the room once more. Heavy, suffocating silence. She raised the microphone again, her voice steady, though her chest heaved with the weight of this moment. "You see," she said slowly, her eyes sweeping the crowd, "this wedding was never about love. It was about ego, about greed, about cruelty. He thought I was nothing but a game to be won, a prize to be shown off. But he was wrong, because I am not a prize. I am not a bet." And tonight," she paused, her eyes boring into Daniel's, "I am not his wife." The hall exploded. Chairs scraped as guests leapt to their feet, some cheering, others shouting in outrage on her behalf. Applause thundered like rolling waves. A woman cried out, "Good for you!" and the words were swallowed by the roar of voices rising to support her. Daniel stood frozen, his face flushed crimson, his mouth opening and closing like a man struggling to breathe. His lies had been his undoing. His pride, his arrogance, his betrayal, they had all been turned into a blade, and she had wielded it in front of everyone. She lowered the microphone, her eyes locked on him, her expression calm, resolute, victorious. "The bet's over, Daniel," she said coldly, "and you lost." The roar of the crowd shook the very air, drowning out whatever feeble protests he tried to muster. Her words, simple and sharp, cut deeper than any dagger, and as she stood tall in her wedding dress, bathed in light and applause, she knew this wasn't just revenge. This was justice. The silence in the room was suffocating. It wasn't the silence of peace, but the silence of a storm that had just been unleashed. Every guest sat frozen in their seats, as though even breathing too loudly might shatter the fragile moment they were witnessing. Glasses trembled in hands that no longer had the strength to lift them. Forks hovered above half-eaten plates, forgotten. The music had stopped long ago, but the pounding of hearts filled the void. She stood in the very center of it all, her veil glowing beneath the chandelier's firelight, no longer a symbol of innocence, but of defiance. She wasn't trembling anymore. The cracks in her mask had vanished, and in their place stood steel. She was no longer the blushing bride who had walked down the aisle earlier that day. She was a queen taking her throne, unshakable and untouchable. Daniel, once so smug and untouchable himself, suddenly looked small. His shoulders slouched under the weight of her words. His skin glistened with sweat that trickled down his temples, betraying the panic he fought to contain. His perfect composure had unraveled thread by thread until nothing was left but desperation. He opened his mouth, clinging to the only weapon he had left, denial. "This is ridiculous," he barked, his voice cracking, trembling like glass about to splinter. "She's lying. She's twisting everything." But the words rang hollow. No one in the room believed him anymore. His voice carried no power, no authority. It was the sound of a man clinging to the edge of a cliff while the world watched him slip. Her eyes never wavered. She held his gaze, with a calm that chilled him, a calm that told him he had already lost. And then, with deliberate precision, she reached into her clutch. Every eye followed the movement, breaths held as she pulled out a thin folder. Harmless looking at first glance, but in her hands, it became a weapon far sharper than any blade. "These," she said, raising the folder high enough for all to see, "are the documents you signed without ever bothering to read. The ones you thought would give you control over me." The hall erupted in gasps. The sound rolled across the room like a tidal wave swallowing the silence whole. Guests leaned forward, straining to see the papers stamped with unmistakable legal seals. Daniel's eyes widened, horror dawning as he recognized them instantly. The blood drained from his face until he looked like a ghost of the man he once pretended to be. Her lips curved into a smile, not cruel, not mocking, but triumphant. It was the smile of a woman reclaiming what was hers. "The prenup you bragged about," she said, her voice ringing with clarity, "it's void. Every clause, every word you thought would bind May, it's worthless. Every asset you tried to cage under your name, already returned to me, and my father's estate, the land you plotted to steal through me, it was never yours. It never could be. He protected it, just as he always protected me. You'll walk away with nothing. Not my love, not my fortune, not even the pride you thought you'd flaunt here tonight." Her words landed like thunder. Daniel stumbled backward, his legs nearly buckling beneath him. His eyes darted wildly around the room, searching for rescue, searching for a friendly face, but there were no allies left. His so-called friends, his groomsmen, even his own family, they were retreating from him, their gazes cold, judgmental, some even tinged with disgust. He was no longer their golden boy. He was a fool exposed. And then the laughter began. Soft at first, bubbling in the corners of the room, but growing louder, stronger, until it spread like wildfire. Guests chuckled, sneered, and whispered words that cut sharper than knives. She destroyed him. He deserves every second. What a pathetic man. Daniel's face flushed crimson, his mask of arrogance shattered beyond repair. But she wasn't finished. Not yet. Slowly, she lifted her hand and reached for the ring on her finger, that small golden circle that once promised forever. She twisted it, her movements slow and deliberate, letting the entire room watch. The lights caught it one last time, a final glimmer of what should have been, and then, without hesitation, she let it slip from her grasp. The sound of the ring hitting the floor was deafening, a single metallic clang that echoed louder than the orchestra, louder than the whispers, louder than the applause that would soon follow. It was the sound of chains breaking. "I do not," she declared, her voice steady and commanding. "Not now, not ever." For a heartbeat, time itself seemed to freeze, and then the room erupted. Applause thundered through the hall like a storm breaking free. Cheers rose, raw and unrestrained, some guests even standing, others crying, their hands red from clapping. They weren't just applauding her, they were celebrating a revolution they had just witnessed with their own eyes. Daniel collapsed into a chair, his face buried in his hands. His shoulders shook, not with anger this time, but with defeat. His perfect suit, his polished hair, his practiced charm, none of it mattered. He was nothing more than a man stripped bare, his lies exposed for the world to see. And she? She stood taller than ever before. She gathered her gown in her hands, its fabric flowing like a river of light, as she began to walk down the aisle once more. The same aisle she had walked earlier that day, but this time each step was hers and hers alone. Not as a victim, not as a pawn, but as a woman who had refused to break. Whispers followed her as she passed. Unbelievable. She's incredible. She won. At the doors, she paused, turning back one last time. Her eyes found Daniel the man, who had called her a prize, who thought he could gamble with her dignity. He sat crumpled and hollow, nothing left but the shadow of arrogance. Her voice sliced through the roar of the crowd, sharp and final. Enjoy your game, Daniel, because in the end I was the only one who knew how to win. And with that, she pushed open the heavy doors. The night air swept in, cool and liberating, washing over her like a baptism. She stepped out, no longer bound by lies, no longer caged by betrayal. Every breath was her own. Every step forward was a declaration of freedom. Inside, the applause still thundered, spilling into the night. But she didn't need it. Her victory was already written. Because on the very day she was meant to be a bride, she became something far greater. She became her own savior.